There we are, top of the hour. Thank you guys all for joining our webinar today on demystifying carbon offsets, how individuals, organizations, and communities can reduce net carbon emissions now. My name is Michelle McGinty. I'm the Program Outreach Manager at Center for Resource Solutions. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Sam Talene, who's the General Manager at Terrapass, to give us a perspective as a carbon offset retailer, as well as Annie Bevan, the Global Head of Sustainability at Superior Essex Communications, to give us a viewpoint from a corporate purchaser of carbon offsets. Before we dive in here, just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded, and both recordings and the slides will be available on the CRS website within a few days. We'll also send a follow-up email afterwards with a link as well as a survey, so please share your feedback. Finally, we are going to leave some time at the end for questions, so please do ask your questions as they come out throughout our presentation. There's a Q&A section where you can add those. There's also a chat function, so we do prefer if you can put them in the Q&A to help us keep track of those. And if we don't get to your question in time, we'll be sure to follow up over email. So to get started, firstly, a little bit about Center for Resource Solutions. We're a nonprofit with the mission to create policy and market solutions to advance sustainable energy for the last 25 years. To that effort, we have a few different work streams. We work on some expert assistance projects. We also work on renewable energy and climate policy. We're not a lobbying organization, but mainly we give expert advice on carbon accounting issues and REC accounting issues, and especially how the voluntary and the compliance markets might interact. We also recently launched the Clean Energy Accounting Project, or CEAP for short, to tackle tricky clean energy accounting issues, with the first paper published on the right here about accounting for standard delivered renewable energy. So check that out if of interest. We also host the annual Renewable Energy Markets Conference, which will be happening in September in Minneapolis. And finally, what we're probably most well known for is our Greenie certification program for both suppliers and users of voluntary renewable energy, carbon offsets, and newly biomethane, or renewable natural gas. So to start this conversation, we first must understand about what is a carbon offset. So a carbon offset is a certificate representing the reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent emissions. So it's an actual reduction of carbon emissions. So now I want to review what we call the paver requirements, which are the items you should be looking for to find a high quality carbon offset. I'm actually going to skip to the second one because it's such a key component for carbon offsets of additionality. The carbon offset project must be beyond business as usual. In other words, it has to represent a change in behavior spurred by buyers in the offset market in order for those buyers to claim to be reducing carbon emissions equivalent to reductions they would have undertaken themselves. So to explain this a little bit further, here's this helpful graph showing a little more about what additionality means. So here you have on the left axis the emissions, and as you see with the red line is the baseline scenario, so without any sort of carbon offsets. Then offset project activity that is facilitated by the sale of the carbon offsets in the carbon offset market occurs, which then reduces emissions. And that delta and chain difference between the two, that's the carbon offset that you're using to, you actually pay for an emission reduction to then count against and net out your emissions. So additionality is really key to make sure you're not just paying someone to continue some sort of baseline scenario that would have occurred anyways, but that the carbon offset's actually causing an emission reduction. Going back to the top here, permanence. So this is talking about the emission reductions must last in perpetuity. They cannot be reversed. So this comes into account a lot with projects such as forestry projects, where perhaps you're, planting trees or you're paying for a forest not to be cut down. What happens if there's a forest fire, for example? And so there's special tools utilized in those scenarios, actually called buffer pools, where you have excess, forestry that you're protecting outside of the carbon offsets you're selling to actually fulfill and replace those trees that were lost in a fire, for example. Another thing we're looking for the V is verified. So emission reductions must be demonstrated to have occurred in the amount reported with supporting evidence, and project performance must be consistently and credibly monitored by a third-party verifier. This is crucial. You might see someone out there saying, we're selling carbon offsets with nothing to back it up. Well, you really need strict verifiers to ensure that those carbon offsets are actually occurring. And this is where project level verification becomes really important. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as it associates with greening climate on how we ensure that those projects are actually verified. For E, we have enforceable. So emission reductions must be backed by contracts or legal instruments that define their creation and ensure exclusive ownership. So these are intangible commodities, so it's really important to have those contracts to back them up. And finally, real. So carbon offsets must not be artifacts of incomplete or technically flawed accounting. From a global perspective, there is a real reduction in emissions in the amount specified. So it's important to remember these carbon offsets are representing real emission reductions. Here's a little bit of an overview of some of the different project types. So it's a pretty diverse types of project, any kind of activity really that can reduce emissions or sequester them. A few to point on are renewable energy is an interesting one for those of you who are familiar with the renewable energy certificates, which represent 1 megawatt hour of renewable attributes. Well, the carbon offset is a completely different thing, and that instead it's representing the avoided emissions essentially by switching over to renewable energy instead of the base scenario of using fossil fuels, which have emissions for electricity. Another interest, and so in that way, for renewable energy projects, if you do qualify for a carbon offset, you have to choose whether you're offering renewable energy certificates or carbon offsets, because you can't double count the renewable attributes. Another interesting thing about renewable energy is that additionality piece I talked about, where you have to prove that the sale of carbon offsets is actually making the project occur. And so in the US and other more developed renewable energy markets, you won't really see carbon offsets being facilitated with renewable energy because it's hard to make that additionality use case because there is such a robust renewable energy market that it normally makes economic sense already to go renewable. Where you'll see the carbon offsets for renewable energy is in more nascent markets, perhaps like India or Turkey, where that funding is really needed to make the project move forward. Another one to point out is landfill methane capture is a pretty popular one in the US, where you're actually putting a cap on landfills so the methane doesn't get released in the atmosphere, which we know it has really high global warming potential. So now to talk briefly about Green E climate. So Green E certifies carbon offsets, just like if you're familiar with our energy side where we certified renewable energy and RECs, this program certifies carbon offsets. It's a very similar program in providing retail assurances and also quality assurances. We have a separate Green E governance board that sets our standard for Green E climate that includes important environmental stakeholders such as NRDC and Unit of Concerned Scientists and CDP. So they first say for quality, what carbon offsets would qualify for a Green E climate product. So what they're looking for is those paver requirements I reviewed, and they actually evaluate the project level verifiers who I mentioned about. It's so important that you get verified. So these are endorsed programs that are listed on the right. So we have Verra, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, and American Carbon Registry. So essentially they have different protocols for the different project types to confirm that the carbon offsets are meeting these paver requirements. And so these are endorsed programs who we've evaluated their protocols to say that they're rigorous enough to meet our quality assurance. And they do the great work of actually going out and verifying the project, and we're not redoing any of that work. The other piece is that we go a little bit step deeper in that there's certain protocols, even from our endorsed programs, that we don't accept. Either maybe it's an older protocol that's not as rigorous as we're looking for, or perhaps it includes large hydro, which just like on the energy side, we want to avoid considering some of the environmental concerns from that. So once you have the high quality carbon offset that is pointed out by Green E Climate, then we actually add the retail certification. We're the only retail certification for carbon offsets. So through this, we actually provide oversight of the seller themselves through 2 annual audits. We have the verification audit. We're actually confirming the appropriate amount and type of carbon offsets are being retired on the customer's behalf. So if you go to click, buy this carbon offset now, we're actually confirming that you're getting what is promised to you. Also, on the marketing side, we have certain disclosures that we require through Green E Climate to give consumers the be educated on what they're actually purchasing. So again, if you see buy a carbon offset online, but no other information about what you're getting, that's a red flag that you should be looking out for. Or Greenie Climate requires them to disclose what type of project you're getting, where it's located, the vintage, and most importantly, what project level verifier is being utilized, since that is such a key component to be looking for. One neat thing about carbon offsets is they can actually be utilized across all the different scopes of emissions. So if you're unfamiliar, carbon emissions are usually outlined in 3 different scopes. Your scope 1 is your direct emissions from your company or facility or your own vehicles. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions, which would be from like your electricity usage and the emissions that come from that. And scope 3 is pretty much everything else. So whether they be upstream emissions, such as emissions of your suppliers or your business travel, or downstream emissions, such as the emissions from disposal of your products or use of your products. And so if you're familiar with the renewable energy certificates, those can only be used for scope 2 because they're actually equating to the renewable attributes of renewable electricity specifically, where the nice thing about carbon offsets, it's an emission reduction of carbon. So that's why it can be used across any of the scopes to net out your emissions. Another call out I have here is that carbon offsets can actually be bundled with products and services to help your customers actually reduce and net out their emissions. So for example, Greenie certifies a lot of carbon offset natural gas products. So there's about a dozen sellers who are bundling Greenie Climate carbon offsets, which their sales of natural gas give their customers a greener option. You could also bundle carbon offsets. Having airlines selling carbon offsets with their tickets is something Greenie could certify as well to help the airline's customers mitigate their scope 3 emissions. Or an online retailer might just purchase Greenie Climate carbon offsets to actually offset their customers' shipping emissions. So there's a lot of interesting things you could do with carbon offsets to both help your own scopes of emissions as well as help your customers reduce and net out their scopes. So it's important to keep in mind that there's many tools to reduce your carbon. So one of the critiques of carbon offsets is that it can allow organizations an easy way out to pay their way to achieve their carbon goals and not actually do the hard work of reducing direct emissions. So that's why it's really important to think of carbon offsets as one of the tools, but to also keep a focus on reducing your direct emissions. Firstly, through energy efficiency. We all know the cleanest electron is the one not utilized. So you should always be continually reducing your energy usage. And then also for the energy you do need, you should always be trying to source renewable energy, because then you're directly reducing your emissions by sourcing a clean energy resource. And then throughout, as you continue to work on 1 and 2, then you purchase carbon offsets for the remaining emissions to net out your remaining emissions. And that's an important note too, that carbon offsets can only be used for net carbon emission calculations. You're not directly reducing your emissions. You're paying someone else to facilitate a carbon offset project to then net against your carbon emissions. I also call out here the term carbon neutral. You're probably hearing that a lot more and more from companies. There's some different definitions floating around there, but the one I used here is that greenhouse gas reductions released into the atmosphere have been reduced to or avoided, and the remaining ones are compensated with carbon credits. This should include all scopes of emissions. So I really call out that last sentence because if you tell a customer on a product that, for example, that this is carbon neutral, they're going to assume it's completely carbon neutral, that all the carbon's been neutralized from the production of that. And so that does need to take into account the upstream and downstream emissions of your scope 3. Also a call out here, our Greenie Marketplace program, where we actually certify marketing claims related to renewable electricity, such as products made with renewable electricity or businesses using renewable electricity, and the ability to use our logo to certify that claim for different businesses is actually expanding to also certify claims that include carbon offsetting, such as carbon neutral claims or claims that you're offsetting shipments and things like that. I always get questions about reporting carbon offsets, so I thought I'd take a second to talk about that. So I mentioned, carbon offsets can net out any of your scopes of emissions, but different organizations have different rules around reporting to them or their leadership programs. So science-based targets, for example, companies must set targets based on emission reductions through direct action within their own boundaries or their value chain. So in other words, carbon offsets can only be considered to be an option for companies wanting to finance additional emission reductions beyond their science-based targets or net zero targets. So again, here they want you really to focus to reduce your direct emissions, because that's ultimately what we have to do to get to our carbon goals as a society to reduce climate change. But you can still, they're still encouraging this purchase of carbon offsets as kind of the cherry on top to continue to do all that you can right now. CDP similarly has you report direct emissions only, and then carbon offsets can then be reported additionally outside of the direct scope of emissions. So again, you want to be able to report your continuing work to reduce your direct emissions, and then you can also report a net calculations after that using your carbon offsets. So some other considerations to keep in mind when sourcing carbon offsets. Firstly, the co-benefits. So these are additional benefits outside of the carbon reduction. So for example, on the left here, all carbon offsets have that 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide reduction or equivalent. So that's always the baseline. And here you have, the renewable energy projects or the landfill methane capture projects are all doing that. On the right, though, some projects might have more co-benefits that you're looking for. For example, perhaps a forestry project, you're actually protecting the biodiversity in that area, as well as the watersheds in that area. Or perhaps a transportation project, you're actually creating jobs through that public transportation, or also health benefits of the people in that city. So you can look for the different co-benefits that you want that come on top of just the emission reductions. Another thing to look for is consider the location. So you can actually source carbon offsets globally, but some buyers do have location preferences. Perhaps they want to source more locally so that the co-benefits go to their local community. But as far as the claim goes and what greenie climate requirements are, you can actually source anywhere around the globe. And here's an interesting pictograph about Q1 2021 and where carbon offsets were issued. So here, it's interesting to note that in the US, most of these offsets were forestry projects, while in India and Turkey, they were mostly renewable energy projects. In China, it was a bit of a mix of both. So you can actually source from any of these locations and make accurate claims. You should also issuer issuance or vintage of when that carbon offset was actually occurred. So for claims and for greenie climate, there's actually no vintage requirement for carbon offsets, because an emission reduction occurring is what we're looking for no matter when it happened. But some buyers do prefer newer projects. So through greenie climate, we do require they disclose the vintage. So that's something that you could look into and have preference for. Finally, price is obviously something to look for. So there's a large variance in price based off cost of the project, and as well as supply and demand. So that's something to consider. Here is from Ecosystem Marketplace 2021 report. And as you can see here, renewable energy and forestry and land use projects remain the most popular year over year, likely because of price as well as availability and also the co-benefits. And keep in mind, you see a big variance of prices here from $9 down to 88 cents, and keep in mind that these prices are averages, so likely skewed from, large purchases that get those added benefits of lower prices. But as you can see, it just gives you an idea that there's a wide range of prices for these offsets. So finally, as far as next steps on how to source, again, look for greenie climate carbon offsets or request that from your sellers so you get those quality assurances as well as that third-party oversight of the transactions. You can find all greenie sellers on our website at this link, including Terrapass, who's about to speak in a moment. And also, if you're an individual or small organization and just want the easy button to buy something directly online, I definitely recommend checking out Green Mountain Energy. Actually has an online portal where you can just purchase offsets right there. So that's an easy option as well. And also a plug for our conference. If you are interested on the renewable energy side of things, check out REM Asia. That's happening April 26th through 28th, and it is virtual. So check that out. As well as I hope to see some of you in person finally at Minneapolis at REM US in September. Here's my contact information, so feel free to reach out if you have questions or put them in the Q&A right now. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sam.
All right, thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. That was great, and I'll definitely build on a lot of the things you introduced for us. So Quick introduction to Terrapass. We are one of the longest serving carbon offset providers. We've been around since 2004, which is somewhat of a rarity in the space. And we provide both carbon footprinting solutions, carbon reduction information, and then also carbon offset products and tools and programs for businesses down to individuals. So that's what we spend our time doing. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So on a regular basis, we're getting calls from businesses, like Michelle mentioned, that are asking, how do I become carbon neutral? There's so many headlines. And this is where a lot of our conversation starts with those businesses. And these are really our guiding principles that we advise: calculate, conserve, and offset. And it's important that, and we always advise clients that they are done in that order. And what this means, basically, calculate is really understanding where carbon emissions are coming from in your business. And this this step is really an element that businesses need to operationalize. It's something that's done annually, and it involves, we saw the slide from Michelle on all the different areas where scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are coming from. And each of those areas, you have to collect operational data. You have to use that in carbon footprinting tools and models to generate your carbon footprint. And one of the things we see with a lot of clients is just getting access to data in the right way is the first challenge to visibility to your carbon footprint. So Terrapass, we do provide a variety of free and also service tools for carbon footprinting for businesses down to individuals. So if a business wants to understand what kind of data do I need to collect about my business, that's a great place to start, is look at what kind of data our tools are asking for. Second step, equally critical, is conserve. And conserve basically means eliminating or reducing carbon emissions wherever you can. This really takes the form of, again, something you want to operationalize for your business as well. And it really involves, once you've identified where your carbon emissions are coming from, create a plan to reduce that over time. And this is something involves things like energy efficiency to use less energy, maybe things like installing solar on site or electrifying vehicle fleets. So these are things that take planning, they take budgeting, and it's something that happens, that's a journey that all businesses and all of us are on, to eliminate emissions that we do have. And one of the things we do see is that most businesses, really all businesses at this stage, at the beginning stage of emission reductions, do have a significant footprint left over as they continue to eliminate emissions. And then there are also some technologies that don't have a zero carbon option yet. And that is really where carbon offsetting comes into play for businesses' sustainability plans. And that's where companies can purchase carbon offsets to address the emissions that they can't eliminate. And we really do emphasize that we know that reducing carbon in the atmosphere as quickly as we can is the most important thing. And so pairing conserving and offsetting is really the way to take the most aggressive climate action. And that's what we work with our clients with. Let's go ahead and go to slide 2, please. So a big question is, Michelle did a great job of identifying some common carbon offset projects. So what makes something a carbon offset project? And the registries that Michelle mentioned are really the drivers, and they are critical participants in this industry. And only certain types of projects are allowed to produce a carbon offset. We'll frequently get questions that say, hey, I just reduced these emissions, can I get a carbon offset? And the answer is no, for a lot of the reasons that Michelle mentioned. But the best place to understand what carbon offset projects are with the registries. And these registries, their job is basically, they're independent, nonprofit organizations, and they identify scientifically valid forms of carbon reduction. They establish really rigorous data collection and reporting and calculation standards, and that becomes a particular methodology that is an approved carbon offset project type. And then separate from the registries, there are independent project developers who will go then and build these projects based on these methodologies. And all of these projects, they are really capital projects. It's like building a new manufacturing plant, but you're really manufacturing carbon reductions. So they have significant upfront costs, they have continuous operating expenses, and so they need revenue for many years to support the economics of what they're doing. And carbon offset sales are how they generate that revenue every year. So as they're reducing carbon emissions, they generate offsets, and they need people like you and me to buy those so that they basically pay back their costs and continue to operate and continue to reduce carbon emissions every year. Looking at the different types of carbon reduction projects, on the right, I identified a screenshot from Vera. So they have 12 different categories of project types, and within those, there are several methodologies. So what you're going to see is there are a wide range of carbon offset projects. Michelle mentioned the most common ones, and the most common ones that we tend to see as well are, forestry and landfill gas capture and destruction. I think an exciting area in the carbon offset space right now, there's a lot of emerging project types too. And we're given the demand for carbon reduction, there is just a lot of energy, a lot of activity around more ways to reduce carbon. Some of the new ones that we're seeing, soil carbon offsets are something that are emerging and have become something that a lot of businesses are looking for, and that's where there's been a lot of scientific evidence of carbon being a sink or a soil being a sink for carbon, and methodologies have been introduced for farmers to manage their soil practices in a way that hold the carbon in soil. And so we've seen Vera and others introducing a soil carbon offset methodology. We're also seeing a lot of new technologies, direct air capture. These are plants that are literally sucking carbon out of the air and removing it from the atmosphere. And that's technology that is it is working well down the development phase as well. So in the big picture, the carbon offset industry is fairly young, but it is developing and it is growing. It's growing rapidly because of the tremendous need that we have. What this wide variety of project means to us and how Terrapass, what we see when we're working with businesses, Michelle did a great job of hitting on this, is working with clients to navigate their priorities, where you're identifying budget constraints. Different projects have different cost bases and different price. Your geographical footprint, where would you like projects, relative to where your business operates or on the globe. Based on your strategy. And then certain project types, we see businesses gravitating towards certain projects depending on their sustainability strategy and how that connects with their business. For instance, you might see a food products company that decides they want to do farming offsets to support climate-friendly farming. We also see a lot of sustainability organizations looking for environmental social justice products, where you might have projects where you might have a forestry project that is supporting indigenous populations as well. So a lot of this becomes, at Terrapass, we work with our customers to put together the right supply portfolio of projects for your carbon offset needs, and so that you can run a carbon offsetting program that aligns with your business. Let's go ahead and go to slide 3, please. And then, really, I think Michelle did a great job too of identifying the need for independent third-party verification. Carbon offsets, in many ways, are basically a carbon reduction service. We are funding these projects to reduce carbon on our behalf. So you're not getting a box of carbon offsets at your door. What you're doing, but what we need to do is provide that independent third-party validation that, yes, we have purchased carbon offsets, and yes, we have funded impactful, effective carbon reductions for our business. So when Terrapass looks at product integrity, the first choice that we make is which registries will we buy from, which projects within those registries will we buy from. And similar to Green E, we buy from what we consider the top 4 registries: Vera, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, and Gold Standard. And these are going to be the registries that are the most rigorous. They take some money to get a project approved onto these registries because of the amount of work it takes to document your processes, to report what you're doing, and the thoroughness of these projects. So first, the quality of the registry is really important to us. And the other things that they provide are transparency. So all projects on these registries have publicly available reports. Data, when data is collected on a project documenting carbon reductions, it's posted online. Verification reports. And at Terrapass, we'll review all of this information before we buy from projects to confirm that we we are comfortable with the status of the project, and that the project is being inspected, the data is complete. And we know these registries, are doing fantastic work to do that. And then Terrapass, on behalf of our clients, will just look and confirm that as well. So upfront, choosing projects from the right registry is really critical. The other piece, and this is really important, related back to our host, Greenie, for this, is the independent assurance. And we do that in two ways. We have an accredited accounting firm that audits all of our sales, and they confirm that we have retired carbon offsets to match all of the sales we made to customers, to make sure all customers are getting what they pay for. And then on top of that, we complete, for a large number of clients, we do complete Greenie climate certification every year. And for any client who is looking for the highest standard of assurance and integrity on a carbon offset purchase, we always recommend Greenie for the thoroughness of the assurance from project to retirement. So that's a process we are strongly in favor of and value. And all of this, I think, is really important, especially right now in the industry. With the trends in the carbon offset industry and growth, we are seeing a lot of innovation, and that is fantastic. We need a lot more ways to reduce carbon. And so we're seeing companies doing great things, using blockchain to provide enhanced visibility to the chain of custody on carbon. And there are companies who are coming out with some of their own methodologies for carbon reduction, validating their own carbon emissions. And so there is a lot happening in this space right now, new entrants, new players, new ideas. And the big advice we tend to have with companies is, whoever you choose to work with, always recommend making sure that in some form there's trusted, independent, third-party validation of their processes, making sure they're validating what the projects are doing, they're validating that the company you're buying those carbon offsets from is doing everything they said, and all done by a trusted, independent third party. So that is really a tremendous value of us for the Greenie relationship, and ties into why we like to recommend them a lot. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. And now I'd love to hear Annie from her perspective as a corporate buyer of carbon offsets. And let me stop sharing so you can share yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow, such a hard act to follow there, with both Sam and Michelle just killing it in their overview of offsets and the value of them in the marketplace and services available through Terrapass to enable these offsets. I am going to take it a much higher level, I'd say. So I'm here to talk about the application of offsets from a product manufacturer. So I am Annie. I'm the global head of sustainability for Superior Essex Communications. So we are one of the largest communication cable manufacturers in North America. So we make the cabling that supports mobile networks for broadband cabling. And we also create cabling that goes into the built environment and all the buildings that we exist in to enable communications within our buildings, the internet and data spread throughout buildings. And so I thought it would be good, and we thought it would be good as we were preparing for this panel, to share with the audience what are some ways that any type of company could think about creative ways to start to use offsets to enable a lower carbon economy overall. And us as a communication cable manufacturer have seen the market shift, and we've seen some immense indicators that our customers are in need of us to act and act quickly. And so how can we take responsibility for our impacts as a manufacturer, and not only think about our company-wide carbon, but also think about the carbon emitted in the manufacturing of our products. And so again, just going to take it a little bit higher level to talk about the application of carbon offsets in some creative ways that everyone could consider. And so indicators, like I mentioned, we're seeing, and I'm sure everybody's seen the Amazon commercials, the Ford commercials out there, advocating, educating the everyday consumers on their carbon neutrality plans, their electric vehicles, et cetera. We're seeing an immense amount of corporations making carbon neutrality claims or goals by 2030, 2040, 2050, pledge commitments, acts, and then plans of how they are going to get at a company-wide level achieving carbon neutrality. And like Michelle mentioned, scope 1, 2, and 3. So supply chain is also included in a lot of these goals. So these are our customers. We support these organizations in terms of the buildings that they exist in with our cabling products. So how can our products consider reducing our carbon impact and offsetting that impact to support them in achieving some of these goals? We're also seeing an increase in building standards. So again, focused on not only mobile networks, but the built environment. So indicators that we're seeing is an immense amount of commitment from these organizations to green their buildings, buildings being 40% of the world's carbon emissions. There is a role that every member of the value chain ecosystem in the built environment has to play to reduce that impact. The supply chain of the built environment, I believe, makes up 11% of the world's global carbon emissions. So the products that make up buildings have a significant impact. So how can we, as a product that is used within buildings, address our impact and support organizations in achieving zero carbon standards like those from LEED, Living Building Challenge, the Canadian Green Building Council? A lot of work in the built environment has been done on operational carbon and how can we reduce the operating carbon emitted within buildings, but we haven't done a really great job of addressing the fact that buildings are made up of products and there's a lot of carbon emitted before that product is ever put in that building. So these building standards are starting to address not only the functionality of buildings, but the products and the carbon that's emitted to make the products that go into it. So much so that we're seeing commitments from wide scale swaths of the built environment industry. So organizations supporting Architecture 2030 commitment to essentially start to address the embodied carbon impacts of the built environment. So how can we address the supply chain impacts of carbon and ultimately getting to zero embodied carbon emissions through operational efficiencies and essentially offsets to enable zero carbon buildings and address that 40% carbon impact the built environment currently has. And so, I know that we've been talking about offsets, but I'm trying to bring it to a level of application again from a manufacturer's perspective, and specifically in the sector of the built environment. What is embodied carbon and what the heck does it have to do with carbon offsets today? Why is it important? And so when we're thinking about embodied carbon, I just explained what operational carbon is, which is the carbon emitted through the use of a building. So energy, electricity being used, carbon is emitted by that use. But when we're talking about embodied carbon, it's actually the carbon emitted to make everything that goes into the building before the building is made. So the total life cycle impacts of the manufacture, transport, and installation of construction materials, which is a significant impact of the building. And so if you look at, these are two sort of great charts. So if you see this little house there, I really love that. So the black is actually indicative of what operational carbon is, or the blue is indicative of everything that would have embodied carbon. So the products that make up the building versus the use of electricity within the building itself. And you can sort of see a life cycle of every single phase in which case a product emits carbon prior to it being installed in the building. So from a manufacturer of a product, this is what we're thinking about when it comes to carbon, and how do we offset that carbon then? And to, indicators, again, what we're seeing, studies that we're seeing on the importance of embodied versus operational. We as a manufacturer are looking to support the reality and the fact that over the next 30 years of all new construction planned on Earth, 51% of the carbon emitted from that new construction is going to be operational carbon, or 49% is actually going to be embodied. So the role that product manufacturers must play is significant to reduce nearly 50% of all carbon that's going to be emitted in the world, in the built environment, over the next 30 years. So these are the things that we're looking at and thinking, gosh, how do we understand our carbon impact? And then ultimately, how do we offset it to provide support to the industry to get to carbon neutrality and reduce our carbon load overall? And so we at Superior Essex began our carbon journey in 2014. We are one of the first manufacturers in the industry to produce what the industry calls an environmental product declaration, which is essentially a transparency document of a life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is a scientific study that actually assesses the total environmental impact of a product from raw material extraction to the end of life. And what a number that you get out of a life cycle assessment is, that is very important to this conversation, is we actually get to understand the total carbon emitted from raw material extraction to end of life through a study of life cycle assessment. So Superior Essex has undergone this for 55 plus of our product families, thousands of SKUs, 85, 90% of our product categories have done this life cycle assessment and published environmental product declarations. So we actually know the carbon impact from raw material extraction to end of life of our cabling products. So understanding our product carbon impact was actually just the beginning. And what we were able to then actually do is digitize this information in tools like the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator tool, and have cabling modeled as a category within that tool. So this is something that's really cool and emerging within the built environment, is digitizing carbon data. So you actually can compare product to product of how they compare in terms of carbon impact across the life cycle. So it's really great to see how we compare to some other cabling products in here, and can actually make and drive ourselves to reduce our carbon impact through this digitization of and comparison of environmental product data. And then, I know I mentioned green building being a driver, a market indicator for us, but we understand our carbon impact. We're able to compare ourselves to others, cabling manufacturers in the industry. But what are we doing to then not only be transparent about our impacts, but then reduce our impacts? So we've done a study on what is our largest impacts of our products, our carbon impacts of our products in manufacturing, and actually identified our supply chain and our manufacturing operations as our largest impact areas based on our life cycle assessment scientific study. And ultimately, we have looked at specifically within our manufacturing operations and soon to be in our supply chain, how can we reduce strategically the carbon impacts within our manufacturing operations, since that's the number one thing we can control. So we created action plans over the next 3 years, what we will be doing, and quantified the embodied carbon reduction that we would be having by implementing these energy saving measures at our own operations. And then secondarily, we also have since found out that we have in fact already reduced our embodied carbon. So we published our life cycle assessment CPDs in 2014 and then again in 2019. Through a comparison study by a third-party Green Circle certified, we were actually able to verify that we have in fact reduced our embodied carbon anywhere from 4 to 15% across all of our different product categories that have a life cycle assessment study. So I'm saying this because it's great to be transparent. It's great to understand, but it's really great to identify then how we can plan to reduce our impacts, or also show how we have already reduced our impacts, because action, like Sam says, is necessary before we go to offset. And this is what I wanted to show has sort of been our process before we got to ultimately, we've taken a lot of action to reduce our carbon impact to get to our zero carbon program, which is the applicability of offsets and how all of what I just said relates to the topic of the day. And so Superior Essex is really excited to understand not only our carbon impact, plan to reduce our carbon impact even more over the next 3 to 5 years, but then also offer to the industry an ability to not only quantify the embodied carbon of our products, but then commit to offsetting 150% of those carbon impacts for our products to any building that uses it. So this is a program that we just launched. We didn't feel like 100% carbon neutral was enough, so we wanted to go above and beyond to offset 150% of our embodied carbon impacts of our products to end users in the marketplace. And we actually created a calculator tool internally, in which case we're actually able to, based on the product type and the amount of feet of cable, we can actually quantify how many megatons of carbon over a life cycle that cabling is producing, and then quantify how much it would cost for us to offset all of those megatons to 150%. So this calculator has been a really useful tool for us to identify those costs associated with the purchasing of offsets, but also be able to justify to our customers exactly what we're able to give to them in a means to help them offset their carbon impacts, embodied carbon impacts of their buildings. Something else this calculator does is it actually quantifies what is carbon in real life. So just by choosing our cable over someone else's, we actually can show them that by participating in the zero carbon program through Superior Essex and accepting these offsets, but just by buying and using 20,000 feet of our cable, they would be offsetting the impacts of 392 trash bags going to landfill, sequestering the same amount of carbon as 11.2 acres of forest, two cars not driven on the road for a year, and then 1.7 homes for a year. So bringing this up to a level that the end user can understand has been immensely valuable for them to understand the impact that we're taking to then offset 150% of our product's impacts. And so the end user gets this summary of, by choosing our cable, what they're getting by participating in the zero carbon program, and then also the Green E certified carbon offset. So we do think verification and certification is immensely important, as we talked about today. And we wouldn't want to provide our customers with anything other than third-party validated carbon offsets, so that they can trace where that carbon is ultimately being offset from, and know that it's a very valid claim that they would be able to use to then justify the embodied carbon offsets within their carbon neutral goals within their buildings. And then finally, our next frontier is carbon accounting. And it's been really interesting to have to try and think about this, not only in the product level for us, but in the project level. So our company level. So doing a GHG protocol benchmark, scope 1 and 2, and then soon to be scope 3, and knowing that you can make carbon neutral claims and actually purchase offsets at a company-wide level after taking action to become carbon neutral under the GHG protocol, but then also looking to be a leader. Recently signed the Science Based Targets Initiative commitment to 1.5 degrees C, and realizing through that protocol, carbon offsets aren't accepted means and methodology to get to carbon neutral or get to this 1.5 degrees C level as an organization. So it's been really interesting to navigate this piece for companies. I've had some really great conversations with Michelle and Sam on our journey here, who's been able to help and provide perspective from carbon offsets and certifiers within this marketplace. And ultimately, it's our belief that every company has a role to play. Every company has a means in which case they can start to understand their impacts, not only company, but product wide. And we all can work together to become part of this solution. So I think with that, I know we have a lot of questions to answer. So I'm going to turn it over and ask Michelle and Sam to join me, and appreciate your time here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all that, sharing all that, Annie. It's great to see kind of the full journey from, the nonprofit that certifies to the seller to the buyer. Really appreciate all your perspective. And we have so many questions. So thank you, audience. You've been listening in because you're asking some great questions here. So we'll just dive into that. And on that note, we're probably not going to get, or we'll definitely not get to all of them. So I'll follow up over email to get to all of you after this. So thanks for all those questions. So to dive in here, as maybe this question could be for Sam, and asked by another Sam, Cheshire says, Indigenous communities were mentioned. Do these offsets sell for higher amounts? I assume because of the added kind of co-benefits there, Sam. Do you have any insight to that? And kind of different projects with co-benefits with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, we do. And I think I'll answer that question a little bit broadly to start. And generally the cost of a carbon offset is going to be based on the cost of the project, right? And every project's going to have a different cost structure behind it. And so that can make projects more or less expensive. And then the other piece of carbon offsets is it is a market-driven mechanism. And the goal here is to create demand for carbon offsets, which drives the prices of carbon offsets, stimulates more projects, produces more carbon. And so we do see that Indigenous projects in particular can be at a premium compared to another type of offset, just because they provide multiple elements of environmental and social benefit. So yes, they can be more expensive than a typical just a basic carbon offset project.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for that. And Annie, this question's from you, from Barb. To see what Superior Essex is doing, it's great to see. Have you had competitors move in this direction? Wondering if your carbon impact transparency and offset activities are impacting your relative competitiveness. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. A great question, Barb. Thanks for the question. Have seen our competitors join us in understanding their life cycle impacts. So that's been great to see more and more cabling products produce transparency surrounding their embodied carbon of their products. We have not seen others join us on this offset journey yet. We come from a philosophy, our president thinks a high tide floats all boats, and he wants all cabling manufacturers to start doing more and acting as much as we can to reduce the impact of the ICT industry. So we're trying to be a leader, carve the path, and we'd love others to join us through this journey. It is competitive always, but we do think so sustainability at some points in time becomes non-competitive when we all need to make a change in the world. So appreciate the question though, Barb.
Awesome, thank you. Also from Sam, I'll take this one. Sam mentioned it's not really clear to me the difference between Greenie versus gold standards and the other registries. This is a common question, so thank you for asking it. Essentially, the main difference is that Greenie, I kind of describe it as almost a meta standard in a way, in that for the quality assurance, instead of just being one registry, we're pointing to high quality carbon offsets that have met these quality assurance on the registry. So not all, there's different types of registries out there. Not all of them qualify, only those 4 endorsed programs. Even a little bit deeper than that, there's certain protocols through those endorsed programs that won't qualify. Like I mentioned, if they involve large hydro, are there different concerns with those paver requirements that our board is looking for? And then the really big difference is that we're the only retail certification. So the registries are actually confirming the projects are occurring carbon offsets, but then from there they're done, and then the seller sells them. And there's not really any oversight of that piece. So Greenie Climate is adding that retail oversight by actually auditing the seller themselves to confirm that the correct carbon offsets are being retired, as well as around their fair marketing practices to confirm there's clear disclosures to the customer on what they're actually getting. So thank you for that. And there's been a few questions here. I can't find exactly which one, but about carbon insetting. So I thought this could be an interesting topic to talk about. I'm still kind of a little newer learning about it, but from my understanding, it has to do with reducing your carbon offsets within your value chain, such as in your scope 3 emissions. So having your suppliers, encouraging them to reduce their emissions, which, as you remember from my presentation, is so key, because that's actually directly, reducing emissions in your supply chain or your scope 3. So as opposed to buying carbon offsets for someone to reduce emissions outside of your supply chain, you're actually encouraging your actual suppliers to reduce, which is the ultimate goal. So it's definitely something to look out for. I see Annie nodding your head. I don't know if you have any experience with carbon insetting, or Sam, if any of your clients have any experience with carbon insetting that you want to add to.
Not specifically, but we definitely are seeing well, and Annie could probably talk circles around me but the supply chain, the trend towards supply chain emissions and supply chain pressure, and how companies can reduce the carbon emissions of upstream and downstream supply chains through their role. So that's definitely something we've seen a lot of attention on.
Great. Here's a question. Ben asked if subsidizing a switch to low carbon fuel source is considered permanent if for the amount that the lower carbon fuel was used, even if it's possible that they will ultimately switch back to additional refuel at a later date. So that's a good question to kind of highlight that permanence issue. I would say in that situation, we don't really have a permanence issue, because that delta, that carbon reduction when the alternative fuel is used, that created carbon reductions, and that can be sold as a carbon offset. At a later date, they turn back. That doesn't invalidate that reduction that occurred at an earlier time. So that is still a valid carbon offset. But in the future, if they go back to traditional fuels, then they'll no longer be generating carbon offsets, because they aren't having that delta anymore. They went back to the normal use case. So that's kind of how permanence works. And also, team, feel free, if you find any questions you want to answer, feel free to chime in. There's so many of them, so trying to sort through them. Maybe this is a good one for Sam. Are carbon offsets prices dependent on vintage? And if so, then why, if 1 ton of carbon is the same regardless of when produced?
Yeah, I think that'll play a little bit off of I think the previous answer too, which is again, different projects have different costs. So the key factors in carbon offset prices, it's twofold. It's going to be the cost of the underlying project just sets the price, but then vintage in particular, it is, you want to try to offset as close as you can to when your emissions happened. And so earlier vintage are going to be more valuable in the carbon offsetting sense. Scientifically, a carbon reduction that occurred, a couple of years previously is very credible for a carbon emission that happens today. I think World Bank, they recommend a 3-year window within your emission to your carbon offset. And we do see definitely the industry moving towards tighter and tighter vintages, but then you also do get different project types that have multiple benefits, social as well. Geographic benefits, is there more demand in certain geographies? So you do get market demand for different vintages, different project types, influencing the carbon offsets as well. And of course, registries, carbon offsets from those top tier registries do tend to command a little bit higher price because they are more just a lot of trust in those registries. So there's a variety of factors that will drive carbon offset prices. Even though obviously we're all here to achieve a carbon emission reduction, a lot of these projects add elements to your sustainability strategy that would move that price in a different direction.
Great, thanks for that. And I see Annie wanted to answer this question from Jack about where there's barriers to building the sustainability case study at Superior Essex when several green building standards traditionally exclude your material scope, such as LEED. What was the other market demand?
Yeah, wanted to answer that one because I feel like just looking at the world today in terms of any market signal that we're seeing in the investor community and their demands on publicly traded organizations and what they're asking for in terms of commitments to carbon neutrality, certainly seeing that. We're seeing a need and demand for us to shift as an organization and focus on who are our future employees, how are we recruiting and retaining talent, so how can we take responsibility for our impact and make sure that the new employees that are coming to our organization are seeing a role that they can play in our technology and our products to be a part of the change that they want to see in the world. And then finally, in terms of the green building standards, actually cabling is able to contribute to LEED Well, Living Building Challenge, and all green building standards out there at this time. LEED 2009 did exclude us, but now version 4 and 4.1 of LEED are the reigning, finally, LEED rating systems out there, with LEED 2009 sunsetting very shortly. And so it's great to see that any type of product now can contribute to this. And I can say it's been a battle in some ways because we're educating an entire IT industry who's never thought sustainability. They heard sustainability and they shut down. So now we're doing a lot of work to educate our customers to enable them to realize that actually we can contribute to LEED, and here's exactly how cabling, out of all things, can help you get those points for those credits. So there's a lot of factors that we're seeing, including other customer scope 3 emissions and how we as suppliers to them can support them in reducing their carbon neutral goals. So lots out there, and it was great. It's been a great journey to try and analyze the market as it is, but there's a lot of factors out there to support you in taking this action yourself as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, one thing we are excited about is that in LEED, I think it's 4.1, Greenie Climate is specifically called out as one of the ways to get points through that system there as well. So that's definitely a driver for Greenie Climate as well. I'm going to take this question from Iman. Does CRS anticipate carbon offsets being limited geographically and temporally in the future? Example, region-based offsets and shelf life for said offsets similar to RECs. So I don't know crystal ball for the future, so I don't know what will happen. I mean, in general, we align with the greenhouse gas protocol. So currently, it doesn't have any vintage requirements or global requirements, and different reporting out there, like CDP, for example. So it's kind of up to those organizations if they were to limit it. From what I've heard, I don't hear anything around that. I think there's some discussion, as I mentioned, in the reporting. It's always calculated as a net emission and usually after the fact. So there's been some discussion on, companies wanting to report it more directly, but it is an indirect reduction. So there's that. But yeah, hard to say at this point. But, again, from just the aspects of what a carbon offset is we need to reduce global emissions. So where that occurs doesn't really matter, besides the co-benefits piece of it is why there's no geographic restriction, unlike RECs where you're actually sourcing renewable energy. So it should be in your same market. And then same for temporally, emission reduction at any time is emission reduction that we're looking for. And you're just basically paying to make sure that had occurred. So hard to say, but that's what I know for now. We only have a few minutes left. I don't know if you guys had any other burning questions you saw here you wanted to answer. Feel free to chime in, but otherwise I'll keep looking. I think I see several issues about claims what kind of claims you can make. So one thing to know is I mentioned the Greenie Marketplace program. So that's a great program to participate in if you want more direct guidance and have your claims actually verified by us. But as someone who sources carbon offsets and make claims, Annie, do you have any thoughts on types of claims you guys felt comfortable making around carbon offset sourcing?
Yeah, and actually, Michelle, it's been very nice to talk to you to understand the realities of that in some ways too. So we, I think it's good to be thoughtful on exactly what it is that you are, how you are calculating your offsetting, and what it is, in fact, you're offsetting, as well as then making sure that you are able to get verification in some capacity and being able to say that you're giving Greenie certified offsets. So Michelle and I have had quite a bit of conversation on this, and something that Essex is considering is getting verified for the use of our Greenie certified offsets to our end users. So we provide that certificate to our end users. And by the way, we do work with Terrapass on purchasing those offsets. I forgot to mention that earlier. And so I think it's really important to see this sort of, it's like FSC supply chain sort of certification. It's chain of custody. It's like making sure that everybody who's using and tracking that through the electrons are able to make that claim. So I think it's important to consider verification. And I really appreciated the learning I learned from Michelle on not being able to just say you're getting Greenie offset certified certificates without getting that proper verification.
Yeah, and I see we're at time here, but I would say one just key tip about carbon offset claims is just being as specific as possible. I think sometimes you see organizations saying, like, again, some questionable carbon neutral claims when they really mean they're offsetting their operations, which you can just say that. We're offsetting our operations. We're offsetting our business travel. Just be specific on what you're offsetting as opposed to say, we're carbon offsetting everything if that's not the case, if you're not including scope 3 and other things like that. But feel free to ping me for more questions. I'd love to discuss further. Well, with that, we're at time. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for the audience. Great participation. There's lots more questions, so I'll try to follow up and ping the appropriate parties to follow up over email. But thank you guys again for participating. And this will be sent out after as a recording, as well as the slides will be available. So feel free to share with interested colleagues and friends. Thanks, and have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.